Welcome back, everyone, to our conference. This is our final panel of the conference, focusing on the topic of transforming police in Chicago. So, for this panel, we have a group of activists, organizers, and an elected official to come and share their views with us on all of the topics we've been discussing so far throughout these past 2 days. Without further ado, I'll get right into it. Our first speaker is Rosana Rodriguez Sanchez, who is the alderwoman of the 33rd Ward in Chicago. Prior to her public service, Rosana worked as an educator and organizer for youth and families in the Albany Park neighborhood of Chicago. She has fought for public education, fighting against privatization and school closures in Puerto Rico and Chicago. In the city council, she's advocated for public education, rent control, immigrant rights, and police abolition. Take it away, Rosana.
Hello, everybody. Alderman Rodriguez Sanchez here. Thank you so much for inviting me to be in this panel. I'm actually honored to be sharing virtual space, with amazing people. I'm going to start introducing myself a little bit. I am originally from Puerto Rico, and I grew up in a very close-knit community where people used to take care of each other. That's all I learned, and I had to become active very early in my life. When I was 6 years old, my community came together to organize because we didn't have running water in Puerto Rico, in the east coast of Puerto Rico. My town is called Humacao. So we had to protest a lot. And ultimately, we were able to get our water back. Our water had been diverted to a U.S. Navy base in a nearby town. So since I was 6 years old, most of what I did was, and what I saw in terms of how you can solve community problems and keep people safe, was organizing. Later on in my life, I always had a little bit of a tense relationship with police, because every time that we would go on strike for any reason, we would definitely be mistreated by police. Right. I can name so many moments in my life when I was beaten by police during strikes against privatization, strikes for environmental issues, protests in the University of Puerto Rico for tuition hikes, moments when police would come and take people away and put them in unmarked cars and disappear them for hours, and nobody knew where they went. So my relationship with police was always tense. So when I do want to say that when I realized what the name of the conference was, which was Reimagining Policing, I was a little surprised, and I do want to say that I do not want to reimagine policing, that I do not want to reinvent policing, that what I want to do as an activist and now as an elected official is to reimagine how we can have safe communities that don't rely on policing as the main tool. And we know the way in which we got here. We have been bulking police departments nationwide for decades now. We know that the war on drugs did not work. I think that is a consensus that we have in our country. And regardless, we have refused to, as governments, right, as local and federal government and state governments, we have refused to make the investments that are necessary in order to make sure that our communities are safe. And what are those investments? Well, if you look at the statistics, and in several studies that I have been reading lately, 90% of police calls at the national level are for nonviolent incidents. 90%. I just saw an article a week ago about LA where 8% of the police calls are for violent incidents. 8%. We have decided as a society that every issue that we have in society, every social ill that we have in society, every need that we are not meeting with humane, holistic services, we are throwing to the police. and the police has nothing to do with any of those things. So we are seeing police dealing with mental health issues every time that there is somebody homeless, somebody that is behaving erratically. We call police mostly for disturbances, actually. I've been looking at the statistics in Chicago, and the thing that we call the police the most is for disturbances. That means noise complaints, arguments against neighbors. So we call the police for things that does not require to have somebody armed to address those issues. We are seeing also how at the national level there are other places where crisis response models have been created. There is a place in Eugene, Oregon, where they have a program called Cahoots. This program is a crisis intervention program that is run by a behavioral health professional and an EMT. And they go out in the community with a van, and there are vans that are working 24 hours a day, and they have an incredible range of services that they can provide, starting from de-escalation of conflict. They can address people that are having episodes of drug abuse or overdose. They can work even in self-harm issues. They can work with people that are behaving erratically. They can do a wide range of services, and they can also provide medical emergency help to anybody that needs it. With this program that has been already in use for more than 20 years, they have been able to take over 20% of police calls. 20% is a really significant amount of work. And not only they take care of 20% of the police calls, but only in 1% of occasions they have had to call police to deal with a specific issue. So that means that they are actually being able to meet the needs of people that are struggling and that do not need a police officer to come beat them up or lock them up, but they are being able to have their needs tend to. In Denver, Colorado, there is a similar program. The difference are that the program in Denver, Colorado, is actually run by the city and not and it's not a nonprofit organization, which I think is a meaningful difference. In Chicago, we have shuttered down mental health clinics. We have closed schools. 49 schools were closed under Rahm Emanuel. We shut down 7 mental health clinics. We only have 5 public mental health clinics where people can go and get access to mental health care. And those are problems. At some point, I sat down with the commander of the 14th district and I asked what was the impact that the closing of the mental health clinic had on the amount of calls that people were getting for mental illness related calls. And he said a lot. He said the volume of calls that we started getting was a lot more, because now people don't have the option of being able to go receive treatment as they were receiving treatment with people that they trusted, right, in a consistent basis. So I think we have a really big problem right now nationally. I think that there are ways to tackle these problems in our city. I know it's unusual to have elected officials out here saying that you need to defund the police, elected officials here saying this is not the main tool that we should be using for the safety and the well-being of our communities. So I have definitely joined the ban platform calling for defunding of police. Ban is talking about 75% defunding. Of course, there's a lot of work to do to get to what are the programs that we are building in order to be able to explain to people who have become accustomed to seeing policing as the only tool that we have for safety, how do we then create programs, create support structures that are going to be able to keep people safe? If we look at the amount of money that the city of Chicago spends on public safety, and that budget is divided between several different departments. So if we talk about police, we are spending $1.8 billion a year in policing. If you look at the budget of what we're spending in all of the social services agencies combined, which is the Commission on Human Relations, the Family and Social Service Department, even the libraries, all of those combined, the Department of Public Health, all of those combined does not get to the amount that the police gets, right? I think it gets to a little bit over $1 billion for all of those departments combined. But we do know what is it that makes people safe. We at this point, particularly when we're talking about the COVID crisis, it became absolutely clear that we don't have a safety net. There is nothing for people to rely on, right? The amount of services and resources that the city was able to provide people was hugely inadequate. The unemployment benefits at the state level, hugely inadequate. Like, people are having so many hurdles in order to be able to access resources just in order to survive. We're not even talking about thriving, we're talking about surviving. But then we always have money to put into punishment, to put into into policing of the people. And we know that most of the people that end up being policed are Black and brown people in our communities, right? Which also speaks to the lack of investment that we have historically had in Black and brown neighborhoods in the city. So when we think about it in that way, we can say I can say, and I have been saying this with no problem at all, the approach that we have for safety in the city of Chicago and nationally, when we only rely or mostly rely in policing for the safety of our communities, is a racist approach. And we have to get to terms with the fact that it is a racist approach. If we want safe communities, then we start investing in communities. We invest in jobs. We invest in mental health. We invest in violence prevention and intervention. We invest in family supports, in early childhood intervention. There are so many things that we could be investing our resources in that will dramatically change the material conditions of people. Would greatly reduce crime and would keep people actually safe. So right now, one of my main agendas in City Council is to make sure that we are pushing for divesting money from the police department and making sure that we're creating structures that are going to help us get to a place where people actually feel safe without the fear of being jailed, brutalized by the Chicago Police Department, which we know that has a history of awful conduct in our communities. And to end, I just want to say, in 2018, the city of Chicago paid $113 million in misconduct, in police misconduct lawsuits. We continue to pay police misconduct lawsuits all the time. I sit in those briefings constantly. We are throwing money down the drain, and there is so much good that we could be doing with that money if we actually had the political will and clarity to develop programs that are actually going to keep people safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Rosanna. And next, we have Alicia Hurtado, who's a third-year undergraduate in the college at the University of Chicago, where she is majoring in sociology and critical race and ethnic studies. And Ty Davidson Mahandas are a fourth year in the college, where they are majoring in English and gender and sexuality studies. Alicia and Ty are members of Care Not Cops, a joint campaign between UChicago United and Students Working Against Prisons, calling for UChicago to immediately disarm, disclose, the budget of defund and ultimately disband their private police force. Take it away.
Great, thank you so much. We're gonna actually share a PowerPoint. Hopefully this works. I think we are good. Yeah, so hi, my name is Alicia Hurtado.
I'm Ty Davidson behind us.
And we're both organizers with Care Not Cops at UChicago. We're gonna give like a 15-ish minute presentation on our work that we've been doing, but obviously it is work that exceeds 15 minutes in this, this presentation that we have. So we're really excited to hear your questions, and also at the end we'll share our social media if you want to get connected in any way.
So as Professor Vargas introduced us, Care Not Cops is a joint campaign between students working against prisons and the Students of Color Organizing Coalition, UChicago United, at the University of Chicago. We're committed to building alternatives to police, abolishing the University of Chicago Police Department, or UCPD, and building networks of people, power, and care to render policing systems obsolete. Care Not Cops was created the night that the UCPD shot Soji Thomas, a Black student experiencing a mental health crisis. Then and now, we've called for the abolition of the UCPD as a step towards creating a university and wider community free of systems of policing, punishment, surveillance, and coercion.
So you may have heard in that introduction that we want to disband the University of Chicago Police Department, and we understand that not everyone is in Chicago or may be familiar with what that is. So as you may have guessed, the University of Chicago Police Department is the police department that is owned and operated by the University of Chicago. And it's actually one of the largest police forces, private police forces in the country. And the UCPD has all of the same procedural powers as CPD, which is the Chicago Police Department, within their boundaries or jurisdiction. And this jurisdiction extends far beyond UChicago's campus, where they have like their primary jurisdiction. So if you look on the map that's on the PowerPoint slide, the maroon right triangle roughly denotes where our main campus is, at least like the green shaded in parts within that triangle. And then the black outline is UCPD's full jurisdiction. Just you can see visually how much larger this extended jurisdiction spans. And within this extended jurisdiction, there are around 65,000 people, 50,000 of which are not connected in any way to our university. So what is a private police force? Because the university is a private police force, it isn't subject to the same transparency measures as public police, such as the Freedom of Information Act, which basically allows the public to request for any information from whatever department they are requesting information from. So UCPD is not obligated to share that information. But along with that, it's a private institution, so it's working in the interests of the university. Honestly, just as all like police departments are working for the interests of their respective governments or like upholding certain institutions, the UCPD is no exception. And I also just want to mention really quickly that even though UCPD is not subject to the same transparency as CPD or other public police forces, transparency doesn't necessarily equate to more power, but it is a useful accountability tool. So for example, the Invisible Institute here in Chicago routinely holds CPD to task with multiple FOIA requests, but there's so much that is obscured, and the police union continues to lobby for this information to not be public. So yeah, basically transparency isn't an end goal by any means, but because UCPD is private, we don't even have that. And there's a long list of specific incidents of UCPD targeting students of color and community members, specifically and especially Black male students and community members. And we could list all of them, but we frankly like don't have time for that. But I do want to mention that these incidents aren't isolated. There have been if you just look at the data that UCPD releases, you can see very clearly that Black people are targeted by UCPD. I'm going to read off a couple statistics. So since 2015, 73.3% of all traffic stops and 93.7% of street interviews that UCPD conducted were with Black people. UCPD searches 1 out of 39 African-American drivers at its stops compared to 1 out of 268 non-African-American motorists. And 95% of all of these vehicle searches are conducted on African-Americans. And we, as CareNot Cops, so that information is from a study conducted by Langowski, but we also analyze the data, and just by looking at it, you can see that the word suspicious is disproportionately used with Black people who are stopped with, I believe, looking at my notes, but that's 92 times a Black person was stopped. The justification of that stop was that they were being quote unquote suspicious, while only one other person who was a Hispanic person was also given the same like suspicious signifier. And that all being said, I threw a lot of statistics at you, but I think once we look critically at what UCPD actually does, whether you're looking at statistics or whether you're looking at this huge jurisdiction that doesn't necessarily encompass our campus at all, it becomes abundantly clear that the UCPD is here to protect the university in their project of gentrification, and also gatekeep and target students and community members of color that reside within their jurisdiction. And as Rosanna was saying, it becomes clear that abolishing police, in our case the UCPD, but in general police, what would be a step to providing true safety to our campus community, to our Hyde Park community, to the surrounding communities around us.
So now we're going to talk about like why specifically, like what we mean when we talk about like abolition, right? So when we think about like abolishing the police, it's not only about getting rid of police. We need to also understand it as a part of this larger project of delegitimizing and shifting power away from systems of policing, surveillance, punishment, and coercion that show up in all these other institutions in our community, like education, mental health fields, medical fields, social work. It's about like changing the basic ways we're able to relate to each other by dismantling policing everywhere it shows up. So some of the questions that we get are like, how could we be safe without police on our campus? How could we be safe without police in general? We know, and the research shows, that cops don't create safety. What actually creates safety is accessible quality resources, not just for students, but for all community members. Safe and long-term housing, well-funded education, libraries, cultural centers, support for arts and recreation. It means investing in and building mental health services that are community-based, voluntary harm reduction focused, and directly engaged with the community. And when we think about alternatives to police, we need to be imaginative in envisioning how we create cultures of care, respect, and safety. Like the systems that we have right now, like of policing, like they've been built up over like centuries. There's been like a lot of money, a lot of energy that have been put into them. So it's going to take time and energy, like, and people power to create, you know, the vision for like what could be, what else we could do. But we know that like the path to doing that is through organizing, right? So like when we're building relationships with one another, we're building power. We're able to build a vision together that holds space for all of our needs and fulfillment. We also, you know, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but like, isn't transparency enough? Why don't we just make the review board have more power? Or isn't UCPD better than CPD? What if we just gave UCPD officers like better training? But so we see, like Alicia mentioned earlier, transparency is like just one step towards creating the systems of culture and care and like direct community distributed power that will truly bring us the safety we want. And we cannot afford to allow reformist measures to take away our power and momentum, especially right now. Like when we put money and resources into things like new trainings, like body cameras, like community policing, we open up space to continue to legitimize and grow power in a system that from its inception has functioned to serve the oppressive structure of racial capitalism. While like CareNot Cops is specifically aimed at abolishing the UCPD, we see this as a step towards creating the space to abolish CPD as well, to open up space and resources to create new ways of relating to each other, not just on like a UChicago campus, but like as a whole community, like beyond just UCPD. we can create something like so much better. The systems that we have in place are, like we said, like generations of political and economic investment. But when we like work together and create community with one another outside of these systems that are given to us, we have the power to dream up a better world and bring it to life.
True. So just to go through our demands really quickly as a campaign. First, we demand that the university defund the UCPD. And within that, similar to what Rosana was talking about with her work, we're asking our administration to reduce the budget of UCPD by 50% and redistribute funds to community organizations that are committed to building networks of support that will eventually render police obsolete. Because we know that investing in these community projects that are grassroots and centered around the needs of what people are actually asking for are what create safety ultimately. And then additionally, understanding the expansion of UCPD as linked to this project of gentrification and displacement that our university is upholding. We call for our university to cease the acquisition of property on the south side and to restrict the jurisdiction of UCPD in the short term to only the main campus.
We also demand that the university disarm the UCPD. This means the removal of all weapons, including guns, tasers, mace, and tear gas. UCPD's protocols rely largely on individual officers' discretion, and we have seen this open-ended policy lead to excessive force wielded disproportionately against Black individuals time and time again. Regardless of whether UCPD procedures are made more explicit, it is clear that any weapon in the hands of police is a threat to Black and neurodivergent students and community members.
The third demand, which is disclose their investments in on this graphic, but we demand that the university just disclose their budget for UCPD and all of their safety and security measures for the past 20 years and every year following, which is largely connected to the ways that a private police force is somewhat different in its operation.
And while the previous demands are immediate steps to reducing the harm that the UCPD inflicts, the violence, we want to be clear that these are intermediate steps on the path to full abolition. The violence committed by the UCPD, especially against our students of color and our neighbors in Woodlawn and Hyde Park, will continue until UCPD ceases to exist entirely. We therefore demand that UChicago release a plan this October detailing the steps it will take in order to fully disband the UCPD by 2022.
And if you look at the quote on the right side of this slide, I think that it's important to note that we understand our place as students at the university as being both part of the justification for having UCPD in the first place to provide us safety, and then also used as a financial support for this police force that ultimately is impacting our community. And this next slide denotes several of our campus organizations that have signed on, created solidarity statements or petitions, also echoing these demands. Only because, and I feel like it's important to share this because something that Ty said earlier, the way that we hold these institutions accountable and the way that we amplify the ways that we want to see safety is to come together and organize together. And just as a small plug, if you are a faculty member or are affiliated with the university, please connect with us on social media and find one of these two petitions, but even better than just finding petitions. In order to create this bold and daring future, we need to enact bold and daring action, right? So, and that can happen.
Blue Cross Blue Shield policy, is that what you have?
That's right.
Oh.
Any changes to email address?
Julian, you should go on mute.
Oop.
Sorry about that. Please go. Please.
Yeah, no worries. So what I was saying was that in order to create this future that we want to see, it requires bold action and it requires all of us working together. And so this is an example on our campus of how this solidarity and this movement is starting to be built. But as you can see, there's our social media linked, but I really encourage everyone on this call to think about the ways that we all individually are implicated in ways that various institutions are using policing, surveillance, and other instances of violence to both uphold themselves and uphold these, as Rosanna mentioned, racist structures. And once you interrogate the ways that you're implicated within these things, connecting with other organizers, connecting with people who are on the ground doing this work, and lend your support, build with them, start imagining this future. So yes, we hope that you'll connect with us, and thank you so much. Looking forward to hearing your questions.
Our final speaker is Damian Williams, who is an organizer, social activist, and movement builder. He is a founding member of the Let Us Breathe Collective, an alliance of artists and activists organizing through a creative lens to imagine a world without prisons and police. The collective operates the Breathing Room Space, a Black-led liberation headquarters for arts, organizing, and healing on Chicago's South Side. Take it away.
Good evening, afternoon, everybody. I appreciate being here, and definitely much love to everyone who's went before me. I have a lot of respect and value for y'all, and just great appreciation. Y'all know how it is. I want to start by affirming what I think everyone else's name of just like the name of this gathering that has us here together right now. And saying that, yes, we want to go beyond reimagining police. And I just imagine that title was probably just like the most palatable to get this event approved so that we can have this conversation. And so my renaming and hearing that title is what we're talking about is reimagining society and reimagining humanity. And that vision is a vision without carceral militarism, namely police, prisons, jails, and surveillance on a domestic level, but also just in the back of all of these conversations, it really should be in the front. This is also a global issue. And so we're talking about militarism at large and the way that we as societies invest in war, invest in militarism, and what we see in, however you want to call it, the global South, people of color, the Middle East, the continent of Africa, South, imperialism at large. What we are dealing with in our cities is a local manifestation of this same militaristic project that is destroying our planet and is going to put the survival of our species at imminent risk. And so this is really pertinent and immediate. And so I think for most people, I'm going to imagine there's a lot of non-Black people watching, a lot of non-Black and brown people watching. And this is not just how do I be altruistic for something that is affecting someone else. This is an unhealthy way for human beings to be living, to be investing this many resources into violence. And that's what police and prisons are, is violence. So with that, right, I'm gonna try to make sure I uplift the Black Abolitionist Network, which is emerging, but more importantly, the campaign to defund CPD. Before I start getting into all like the big ideas of what our imaginations need to be or some of the things we need to challenge. So Ed has been said a few times, and I just want to reiterate that there is a campaign right now that is pushing for the divestment from the Chicago Police Department and reinvestment and investment into communal resources. And that number as of right now is 75%. And I say jokingly but seriously, and that's us being nice, as we've seen in other spaces, that we've actually had the discussion of disbanding police departments in real time, as we've seen the uprising of 2020, mostly coming out of Minnesota and the death of George Floyd. So uplift that campaign. That is an avenue or a vehicle for mass organizing. The intention was, as we saw, we had the most politically active time in U.S. or I'll argue human history this summer. And what the campaign is aiming to do is to create a container for all of the political energy, all of the resistance that is happening, to be able to focus and to make sure that the conversation does not get co-opted. Because as defund police was becoming popular language in our society, there was an attempt to separate it or marginalize it from the abolitionist tradition that created that language and made it possible. So I just want to uplift and push that abolition is what we're talking about in this space. And to me, a simple way to understand abolition is a push for healthy communities, a push for healthy relationships. And so that's where we're at. Defund CPD then is a tangible way to make that thinking practical, to bring that theory into praxis, and to be able to organize and build. Because what I believe is all of the solutions people want answers for, those things will be crafted and seeded in organizing work. And that organizing work doesn't just have to be against the police state. I believe all liberatory organizing will get us the abolitionist solutions that we need. So yeah, right? When we say abolition, we're not just talking about getting rid of one bureau of government. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who I should just shout out. Actually, before I say anything else and do all my big word talking about abolition, if anybody's interested in this idea, there are 3 living Black women that made this panel and this conversation on a global level possible. And that is Angela Davis, that is Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and that is Miriam Kaba. Once you get off this, you should just make sure you Google every word they've ever said, recorded, written, and you will be up to date and you will be able to have this conversation much better than you were before. So I just want to uplift them. And if somebody wants to put that in the chat for spelling, I'm sure someone knows who they are, and to acknowledge that this is also a Black feminist tradition. So also the fight against state violence and carceral violence is also a fight not just against white supremacy and anti-Black racism, but it's also against the fight of patriarchy and gendered and sexual violence. So yeah, we don't just need to get rid of departments. We need entire new social norms and new institutional frameworks. We need a new political economy. So this is a structural conversation. This is not just about there are bad cops or there are bad things that are happening. This is about how our society is organized at large. And so I was looking through the chat. What I'm attempting to do here is I don't have like a formal presentation. As I was listening to everybody, I was seeing the questions and just trying to plug in some of the holes or plug in some of the voids. So before we get to like policy, we need to understand the question is, what do we do when someone is harmful? What do we do when someone exhibits behavior that is dangerous or risky to my body or to a community? And that means we also need to have a more humane understanding of behavior. And because police and prisons have been politicized as a way to control marginalized people, it has been very easy to perpetuate a dehumanization. And so I just want to challenge the notion that behavior is a linear succession of rational choices. Behavior is shaped deeply by collective structures, by environments, by experience, by physiology. So what's happening in your brain chemistry, what's happening with your nutrition and your blood levels, and also inheritance, right? So what's happened in our ancestry also affects our behavior on a day-to-day basis. And so if we want to put an end to violent behavior, what that means is we then have to put an end to violent structures and violent environments. And that is what is happening when you invest, let's use Chicago as an example, 2 of every $5 that is supposed to be towards community or towards health is being invested into militarism. Or we can use it on a federal level, on the federal discretionary budget, about 60% of those resources are going to militarism. And so the argument or the claim is, if we just use those same resources, and it's bigger than money, it's actually bigger than dollars and cents, it's really a human conversation. But for the sake of this point, if we use those same resources into investing into health, the violence won't come in the first place, right? So one thing that we need to know about policing and prisons is that it's reactive. And so we will never be able to stop a problem with a series of reactions or a reactionary approach. So similar to health, because again, I'm saying abolition is a push for healthy environments. Similar to how we think about health, we need to have preventative medicine. We basically can think of police and prisons as like a drug or an opiate to numb the pain of the consequences of all of this inequity that we are investing in. So again, abolition is a push towards healthy communities and relationships. So it's not just about knowing how bad the police are, or knowing that police in America descend from the Fugitive Slave Act, or knowing that the Chicago Police Department was instituted the same year as the Indian Removal Act. We can talk about these larger historical trends of genocide and Jim Crow apartheid and redlining, and how police were and are the organizers of this racist oppression. But when we want to talk about solutions, and we want to talk about reimagining, it's a challenge to everybody watching. That what we are saying is we all have to take a higher responsibility. We have internalized notions of like the nation state and this idea of hierarchy. And so basically what we say now is that the government without any real relationship to most of its people, is effective in deputizing someone to be an agent of the state, and then they have the authority to use violence, and none of us else do, right? So there's this idea that there are supposed to be these superiorities and inferiorities embedded in the idea of policing. So instead of, hey, there's something going on, so we as a let's use the campus as an example. We as a campus building, as a residential hall, as an English department, as a social club, we are saying we don't have the capacity or the tools, or we don't have the capacity to learn the tools that are needed to respond to conflict and harm and trauma and mental health. We need to then bring in a military agent because violence is the response to any imbalances that we experience. So that's just something that we need to challenge. And also know that when we're saying abolition, this new society, it is about the relationships that we have, and those relationships require work, require responsibility, and that accountability has to happen through human connection. Let me look at my time. All right, I think I'm doing all right. So again, I just want to establish some like baseline understandings, because the thing that bothers me when trying to have the conversation about abolition is that I notice that we as a society are traumatized. And so once there's trauma, we need healing. And I think information can provide some healing. And I say we are traumatized because violence has become so normalized in the way we teach history, the way we teach social studies, the way we consume media information. The notion of like propaganda is becoming much more popular. So the way that, you know, Law and Order and every primetime TV show and every blockbuster film has indoctrinated us in this idea that agents of violence are heroic, and this is a valorized space that we should revere and always submit to, is something that we need to release so that we can start to think of new solutions, because it is not frustrating, but it's interesting for me to see, hey, this system is rooted in torture. This system is rooted in violence. This system is rooted in slavery. This system is sexual violence and military solutions to human conflicts. And then people say, well, we can't talk about that yet until we figure out what we're going to do. And so my point there in saying is we just need to accept these as reality. And once you say, hey, slavery is wrong, the question is not how do we make slavery better. We just have to sit with that human claim. The 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution says anybody who's convicted for a felony crime is subjected to legally, constitutionally based slavery. That is not a metaphor. That is not history. That is our current law of the land. Anybody watching this in the United States of America, every day that you have woken up and drawn breath, you have been living in a place where slavery is legal. So before we start talking about solutions, just accept that as our current reality. Just another notion. So policing and incarceration is slavery. Policing and incarceration is torture. Based on every notion of human rights, to lock someone in a cage, to sensory deprivation, the lack of access to healthy food, the quality of medical care that people experience in prison, that is a form of torture. And if it wasn't for state authority, we would see it as such. No human being can healthily live and thrive in a cage. Also, police and incarceration in all of its forms is sexual violence. And that is something that people don't recognize on the day-to-day. So the notion of stop and frisk, that's language that's become much more popular in the last 5 to 10 years. If any other person were to stop you and frisk your body, you would name that as assault. You know, I have had loved ones who are incarcerated. Many Black people in Chicago, we experience this in our family. We get frisked anytime we have to go visit our loved ones in ways that are sexual violations. And I'm sure Alice can speak to this well, just the normal policy of what prisoners and people who are incarcerated experience. You know, you've probably seen this in televisions and movies in a way that normalizes it, is the idea of a stripper cavity search. That is sexual violence. And the idea that a person has done something wrong, so now they should be subjected to slavery, torture, and sexual violence, I think is just a philosophical imbalance that we all have to wrestle with. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place. I want to be a little bit more succinct as I wind down the time and get into questions. So I saw, you know, what do we do? And again, like I said, there will not be one solution. The solution will be within communities. And the idea is, how do we have nonviolent, or not actually nonviolent, anti-violent solutions that are preventative? So one thing that I want to know of where we should start and focus is, like I named, gendered and sexual violence. what we need to account for, I saw this as a question in the chat, is that our current system is actually ineffective, and I would argue creates a vacuum or a void that actually perpetuates and compounds harm. So we could look at the tradition of survive and punish of all the young women and trans sex workers or women of all ages who, in protecting themselves from sexual violence, end up getting incarcerated. We can also look at the rates at which actually police officers themselves are one of the highest purveyors of domestic violence in our communities. And so as somebody who is a restorative justice practitioner, and our movement is actually led and survivor-centered, we need to be looking at how do we take local and relationship-driven restorative frameworks that have transformative potential and then extrapolate that and scale that up. But one thing that I just want to name now is that our system is not working, and we assume that it does because we are given, I think, inaccurate information. And so a basic answer to what we need is, first, people need the resources that are required for human survival, and this transcends time and space. Everywhere in the world, human beings need shelter to survive, human beings need food and water to survive, and human beings need access to medicine when they are sick to survive. And Black and brown people, particularly Black people, have disproportionate access to those resources. And those issues then cause mental health, cause other emotional and physical trauma. And those traumas and that scarcity actually creates conflict. And so if we actually reduce the engineered scarcity or the organized abandonment of our human communities and just make sure that we as a society take on the responsibility of maintaining the resources needed for everyone to survive, then we will not be in the violent places that we then invest in violence to respond to. So again, my notes are all over the place, and I was attempting to pull out some of the questions that I saw. But lastly, we just need to, again, transform our human relationships and look towards making a new political economy that makes it easier to build communities where we have cooperative and participatory activity, and where we are able to have reciprocal relationships, because those are the types of relationships that prevent violence and then allow us to respond to violence. And I thank us for having it in this space. I think it's really important for folks who have access to the University of Chicago and the institution to hold this space accountable, not only for its current harms in terms of displacement as a resident of Washington Park and the raising of value that contributes to violence, but also the historical harm and the investment into neoliberalism. So I think about Chile, I think about the divestment of schools all over the country and all over the world. And my sister went to the University of Chicago. I do a radio show there. For those of us who have connections to this institution, it's actually really powerful. This is why I love Care Not Cop so much, for us to be taking this conversation to, in a lot of ways, where the origins of it was centralized. So I'm going to stop there. I feel like I've talked too much. I've gone over my time, and I know that we have more questions to get to. Again, everyone look up the hashtag Defund CPD. We are doing rolling virtual trainings, and also we want folks to connect their organizing initiatives to our list of demands, which you can look up when you see the hashtag. So again, I'm Damian Williams with the Lesbian Collective and Black Abolitionist Network.
I'll get right to it because I want to try and get as many questions in as possible. First, for Alicia and Ty, one of the audience members asked a really interesting question of how does UCPD affect non-university affiliated residents in their jurisdiction? And how might they be another possible constituency in this movement you're trying to build?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question. Like we talked about a little bit in our presentation, like this is a movement that's going to take like everybody's input. We want to be creating solutions that show up for everybody. So this, when we talk about this, like it's not just like a university specific solution that we're looking for. So we like want to be incorporating everybody's voices in. I mean, one of the things that we like try to do as like Care Not Cops is to make sure that we're like partnering with organizations that are already doing this work like outside of like us, right? So like things, organizations like Asada's Daughters, Good Kids Mad City,
Yeah.
sorry.
Let us breathe with Damon. Yeah.
Just like, because we know that like it doesn't, this fight like extends like far beyond just like what we're doing like on U Chicago campus. So I think it's a matter of like figuring out, like Alicia mentioned, like how are you personally like implicated in these systems, and like where can you plug in? Like what is your personal like responsible, like, yeah, just identifying that and like identifying how we can contribute to these. So I think like, you know, this is like an interpersonal, intercommunity like struggle, but there are like places that you can be plugging in outside of just Care Not Cops as well.
This question, I'm going to start with you, Damon, but the question is big enough that I think all of the panelists can chime in. And this has been articulated in many different ways. There are many folks in the audience who are curious to know, what do you do essentially with the most violent offenders, meaning the folks who pose the most legitimate threats to people's safety? Acknowledging that while that's still a very, very small percentage of the case, right? We all know that if any of us lost a loved one to an incident like that, it would be traumatic. So what are your thoughts and questions to audience members that have those kinds of concerns?
Mm-hmm. So again, I just want to like change the framing of how we think about behavior. And so when I hear, extreme dangerous behavior, I do not think that is a healthy person. So my theory or my position is healthy people do not intentionally, consciously commit acts of violence, particularly extreme acts of violence. A healthy mind, a healthy body does not want to kill somebody, right? So that is coming either from a place of panic, of trauma, of different type of disorder. And so for me, I view it as a health issue. And so, I think that means that then we have a system that does not look anything like we recognize, and it has the ability to screen these things early on and to create support, to be able to create check-ins and monitoring. I myself, I recognize I'm from the South Side of Chicago, right? So like that's the thing that's difficult about this conversation, because usually what I also feel is that people with a lot of distance and privilege and protection for the type of violence that their imagination goes to, often are like very eager to ask these questions. So I just this summer had to move because I had a neighbor who exhibited schizophrenic behavior in extreme ways and have been threatening to kill me verbally for over a year, right? So this is, I'm in a new house. This apartment I'm in right now is new to me. Because my abolitionist reality was, calling the police is going to put me in danger, is going to put him and his grandmother in danger. This woman who is, who needs help, he is assisting her. We've been living in this apartment for 30 years. So I was in the position to be able to move and get another space. And so I wish I had someone to call who on a daily or weekly basis was coming in and checking with them, making sure if there was medication that was needed, that was being taken, to be able to communicate, because I moved into that space without any knowledge that this thing was happening and that there is a very real danger present. And so for me, it looks like having a health system or a social service system that is almost a one-to-one. Every person should have access to these things in the same way we think of every student should have a desk in a school. Every human being should have access to health support. And there was one more thing to your question. I guess I can pass it on because I don't want to ramble. But also there are other types of forms, right? So we also usually only think about gun violence or about some type of weaponized threat against life. And what I'm saying is the mechanisms to be able to respond to that, to be able to de-escalate, happen in much more normal day-to-day forms of conflict. So the answer is actually building up your muscles of intervention when you see someone being disruptive in a way that maybe is not physical, but is just social. And then also acknowledging people don't really care about solutions until we start talking about divesting from the police. So there is an infinite amount of domestic violence works and programs throughout the country. There's an infinite amount of street organization and gang intervention programs, and they literally get no attention, and no one wants to talk about them, and no one cares until we start saying, hey, stop oppressing us. So I just want people to and I'm not saying this to anybody who asked the question, before we start talking about what do we do next, restorative justice requires actually centering the harm and healing the harm. And so if you are not acknowledging how harmful and ineffective our current system is, it's not from a place of me trying to condemn you. Your brain will not be able to comprehend the pathways we need for new solutions, because you will still be trying to make space for the normalization of oppression. And the last thing I'll say before I pass it on is that people with privilege and power do a lot of harmful things. And in our state system, are not held accountable in any type of way. So the idea of, hey, these are factories of poor and sick people. Wealthy white people do harmful things, do drugs, commit acts of violence, take people's homes, close down school systems, destroy nation states, right? And there is no framework or no conversation to talk about how that causes these extreme things we think we need solutions for on the ground. So it's, again, I think, changing our framework. But if you are interested, Sister to Sister in New York is a really great example. A Long Walk Home in Chicago, all of the work of Survived and Punished. So if you are really eager to look towards solutions, there is an infinite amount of restorative and transformative frameworks that are happening now and providing real-time evidence.
Other panelists have thoughts on that question?
I think I could jump in here and just echo the very end of Damon's comment, in that when we're thinking through what are police, right? Police are called after some sort of incident happens to respond to that incident. And if we're thinking about what is the actual function of that, of incarceration, of police coming into a space, it's always intervening after any sort of community harm is done. And then once we think of that, why couldn't there be mechanisms such as the ones that Damon was talking about, where we intervene much sooner? Or if we imagine a system where these institutional harms were not implemented in the first place. And I do think also, when we think about restorative justice, transformative justice, kind of thinking about the opposite of that, like thinking about the ways that we're taught from a very young age and kind of through several aspects of society that punishment is something that we need for justice, and like punitive notions of justice are very integral to the ways that the criminal justice system works and the ways that we currently are interacting and interfacing as people. And just thinking about how interrogating why not having police feels so foreign, or like something that can't be achieved, or like why we're asking these questions, or asking like, what do we do with these people when it's clear that these systems that we have in place right now are violent, and it's also clear that we could be imagining ways of justice that don't involve police, don't involve prisons, and still find, or I guess it's arguable that that's even justice, but just imagining different ways that we could be actually supporting one another and not immediately jumping to like a punitive solution.
This discussion, I think the question about justice and reconceptualizing it is huge, and I think it's worth pointing out that of all the disciplines, the discipline of philosophy is egregiously bad at diversity, meaning it's like I want to say it's abysmal. It's like 97, 98% white men. And so, the question of like, how can we even imagine justice requires us to have philosophers of color, right? I imagine, so I see on the list we have, I think, many undergraduates and graduate students in the audience. And so we have a question of how can students on campus, for Alicia and Ty, get more involved in the efforts of your organization?
Yeah, so I think I'll drop the like handles in the chat, but definitely connecting through social media is a good way initially. Just keeping up to date with actions that we have coming up, or if you want to get even more involved, just messaging us and asking that way. Actually, tomorrow there's a Solidarity Street action with college campuses from across Chicago, working on building a coalition of abolitionist organizations from different college campuses, working with community organizations from across the city. So definitely plug into that if you're interested, or if you go to college anywhere in Chicago, roll through and get connected to those orgs. But yeah, I think this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think that something that I said earlier, as far as we all have a responsibility in plugging into this work, I think that that's something for each person to evaluate, but I definitely think that, just either coming to us, coming to Care Not Cops, or just doing that like personal work of unlearning, seeing like where like the ways that you think in a punitive way, all of that is like bringing us closer to people. So yes, follow us on socials. I'll put it in the chat basically to answer that question.
So someone raised the question of there's so many changes that need to happen, so many different ideas that have been discussed, but like how do we put that in a digestible timeline? And I want to start with Ellis because you were a part of the campaign, right, to achieve the reparations from the city council. And so how do you think about timeline in an atmosphere right now where understandably so many folks have a high, tremendous sense of urgency and want things done sooner than later?
You know, again, I think that there is an immediacy, and then there's this assumption that is false, that there is a protection in these systems. So I do believe that getting rid or divesting will, if we did it tomorrow, actually would put us in a better place. I recognize most people aren't comfortable with that notion, and there's so many things that we need to do. I do want to be cautious against being predictive. You know, in any organizing tradition, any liberation work, this is an ongoing struggle. And for me, you know, there's no like promised land or no final victory. For me, this is a generational project. And so I don't expect to see the world that I'm talking about within my lifetime. But then there are obviously institutional victories that we can win. So the example of, you know, the fight for reparations and the abolition of the death penalty in Illinois, you know, we're talking about 10, 15, 20 years of work. But then also we get these high points, right? So, you know, for example, I'm wearing a t-shirt. This is like a smaller project for the Village Leadership Academy, changed the name Grassroots Campaign. They were doing that work for 4 years, and they got no response and were gaslit by the Chicago government pretty egregiously. And then uprising happened, and then overnight, then they have an emergency meeting and change it for political gain, right? And so, like, I would caution folks against being predictive, but we do have principles that we have to always continuously organize for. And then also to pull back a little bit to the last question of like solutions and responses, and I'll be quick on it. One, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, abolition is not about absence, it's about presence. So it's about doing a lot of hard work. So for example, I have sat in a room and after being called about domestic violence happening, and been in that room for 5, 6, 7 hours through the night, and that is hard work, and we need more people to do that. There's been a program of men who did a 3 to 4 day shift of 4 hours posted outside of a household of a man who was living with roommates and would not leave, and they didn't want to call the police on him. They didn't want to endanger him, but he was there as a threat, right? So there was a consistent presence. And so that looks like a few organizers volunteering their time with no resource or structural support. But we also are in an economic crisis. And there's actually a surplus of people who are out of work and who are idle and who also need resources. So if we invested in models like that at a collective level, it's about being present, but also, yes, we need consequence when harm happens, but the idea of some like one standard flat institution is also this dehumanizing thing, because the idea that a woman who's protecting herself from being abused goes to the same place from a man who's intentionally trying to rob somebody and they're just there for different time, right? Like that notion is something we need to erase. Of we have this one size fit all solution. And so what I'm saying is that we need to be prepared in our relationships and in our interactions to be able to customize within our institutional framework. So if everyone has housing, everyone has education, and everyone has a health facility within walking distance, that then is creating the framework for a new response system. Because we're not saying abolish 911. We're actually saying when you call 911, you should have a dozen choices that are actually much more effective and appropriate. And with that, there will be consequence. So I just want to pull that back out. It's not going to be a one size fit all. And the answer for folks who are like, what do we do, is get to work and show up with your people.
I want to give you all of you the last word, just a final thought to end on whatever you would like in about a minute or two. Alicia, time.
Well, I think my point that I want to make really segues nicely from what Alice was just saying, in that what we have right now is a political moment where a lot of things that seemed impossible are feeling much more possible, much more tangible. Like even just going through, we yesterday looked through kind of like strategy, like, oh, like where are we going? Like looking through what we thought our timeline, what our goals were just last year versus to this moment right now. There's so much more possibilities, but the thing is that all of this was always possible. We're just convinced and we are conditioned to believe that we don't have the people power and we don't have the connections, we don't have the voice to actually make change. And I think that now that we can recognize the ways that we're all connected, the ways that this fight can propel us to create the future that we want to see, it's important that we all lean into that. And I guess my hope is that everybody takes this opportunity to get plugged into organizing, to get plugged into the ways that your community is addressing the issues that they need to address, and keeping your mind open to the things that you think are impossible right now, because they're probably not impossible. They're just things that we've been told that we can't do. Yeah.
So Damon, your last word.
Last word is certainly tangibly check out hashtag Defund CPD to stay following the campaign. And I just want folks to leave with the understanding that policing is militarism, and we live in a war-based society, and I believe we're all traumatized from that. And similarly to how we know we have to transition off fossil fuels, and that is a crisis. And even if we can't do it today, there are all these plans to go green over the next 30 years. We need to be thinking that same type of like transitional way, because this is an emergency, and that this is also causing and the consequence of human issue and human conflict, and military solutions, as we see in the Middle East and around the world, will not solve human problems, and that we come from a tradition of making the impossible possible. So they said that our society would not be able to survive if we ended chattel slavery. They said our society would not be able to survive if we ended the Jim Crow apartheid system. And we are in a similar moment right now, and it's going to sound just as ridiculous and just as antiquated in future generations. So be confident, be proud to be alive right now. You are part of the largest social movement in history, even if you're not actively plugged in, just by listening to this conversation. The same way we talk about the 60s, you are part of the 2020s, and we are creating a new possibility that is rooted in health. And it takes a commitment from all folks to use all of their power, all of their resources to make new possibilities. And it's really, really centered in human relationships. The answers will come when we organize together.
Great. Well, on that note, that wraps up our 2-day conference. Thanks to all the panelists. Thanks to my colleague, Julian Go. Usually at this stage of the conference, you would see a really big, massive applause to Julian, who put in the brunt of the work for organizing this amazing event. Stay in touch, and best of luck to you all, and stay safe and stay healthy.